Chilling, man. How's everything on the West Coast there?
Everything's good. You're going to be coming out here in a little bit.
November 7th at Skylight Books in LA with my man Pete Agustin,
That's
who
right.
is he's the founder of Female Fun Records. He's a journalist too who dabbles in music. And he and Doom conceived of the Special Herbs series together.
That's right. That's right.
So,
So, obviously, you're going to be out here, as you mentioned, for the book tour that you're doing for the Chronicles of Doom, which just dropped this week that this episode is publishing. So there's so much ground to cover, but I guess I want to know, just to start things off, when did the idea for this book sort of begin to, develop in your mind?
sure. Well, just to give you a little background, during the pandemic, I was working on a book called From the Streets of Shaolin, the Wu-Tang Saga, which was just a pleasure to do because I'm a huge Wu-Tang fan, always have been. And I was just about to turn the book in, the finished manuscript in that I'd been working on for years. December 31st, 2020, I remember it because I was turning the manuscript in and we were hit with this bomb that Doom had passed away. I was like, wow. And I've always been a fan of Doom since KMD, since we go back. I go back to that era, and I remember at that time they were like one of the groups that everyone was looking at. They were like one of the upcoming new groups. They had put out a successful first album, Mr. Hood. We were waiting for Black Bastards to come out. In fact, I got the cassette advance of Black Bastards in early May, and then it was an incredible album. I was like, wow, this is really going to open a lot of doors for them. And then we find out that they got dropped.
Right.
So it was like lost track of Doom for many years, just like everyone else did. And then my man Prince Paul is the guy who I think told me that MF Doom was Zev Love X.
Right.
So I checked out the album Operation Doomsday. I was like, wow, this sounds nothing like Zev. It's like completely different. So then I got into Doom. I was like, wow, that's a rare case of someone being able to kind of reinvent themselves and come back in the industry. So I followed Doom's career. Obviously, Mad Villainy was a huge album for everyone. I think it's one of the best albums of that decade of the 2000s.
For sure.
And that kind of got me back into following Doom. And I even tried to reach out to work with him at one point, but at that point he was living in England. He was already signed to Lex. It was very hard to get in touch with him. So just to make a long story short, as soon as I handed in my Wu-Tang manuscript, you'd think I'd want to take a break and just like not do some writing for a while. But I was just kind of transfixed with all the news about Doom, all the podcasts that were coming out at the time. And it just gave me like a review of his whole life and career. And I was like, wow, this guy has had an amazing life and an amazing career. I think Doom deserves a book.
Absolutely.
So that was really when the idea kind of popped into my head when I heard about his death. And then, I did research. I worked, throughout 2021 on coming up with a book proposal. And I submitted that to my agent probably like in the spring of 22. And that's when I got the deal. So.
Yeah, I mean, I remember you reflecting on that. 2020 was such a tough year, and then to get that news at the end of the year just felt like the gut punch in what was already sort of an excruciating emotional, period in all of our lives. You spoke earlier about the fact that you were sort of inspired, and as we all were, paying a lot more attention to Doom. In the wake of his passing, because there were so many memorials and conversations and interviews and podcasts. What's interesting to me is that, in the age of the internet, because you've been a journalist, talking about talking about not knowing that Doom was Zevlov X. You got to remember, for people listening, this was before the internet, where this information could be readily verified. So there was just like, hey, this guy is Zev, right? Like there wasn't as easy access to sources of information. But this is a long question, or a long framing of a question. In the age of the internet, where there is so much information out there, what were the challenges and what were the sort of like goal points for you to make something that, could stand alone and also provide new information that wasn't necessarily just, pulling from sources that are available? It's kind of like a long way of saying, and I grapple with this, do books need to exist in 2024? I do believe that they do, but there's also,
of course they do. I mean,
yeah.
It's a good question, because, once again, kind of comparing it to the Wu-Tang book, that book was I probably had 20 years of research for that book. I spent a lot of time with each of the members of Wu-Tang, like in the studio and out. And I felt like I kind of knew them well, in the 90s when I was hanging out with them. For this book, it's an unauthorized biography, meaning the family has nothing to do with it. The estate has nothing to do with it. I'm an independent journalist just pursuing a story on my own. And I think that's the good thing about the internet, is it's like a kind of like a foundational database. It's a good place to start. So that's where I started too. I pulled out all the interviews on Doom that I could find on YouTube, print interviews. Obviously, there's a lot of podcasts and stuff going on at that time. I used that. I basically used every open source, stuff that I had at my disposal to initially do my research. Now, I did feel a little awkward about writing a book about someone who I'd never even interviewed myself, someone who had passed away. It's a real challenge, because you're not, especially when you're dealing with someone who's passed away, there's a certain sensitivity that's got to be built into it, because this man has a family, he's got kids who are left, he's got a wife,
Right.
I don't want to ruin his reputation or anything like that, or just, so I stepped into this. It was an ambitious idea, but I stepped in very cautiously. And I think one of the advantages I had is the fact that, in addition to being a journalist, I'm also an artist and a label owner. So during the 90s, when my independent label Word Sound was really popping, I knew everyone else who was doing independent labels. I knew all of the people. It was a small community,
Yeah.
And especially independent hip hop. So I knew all these people, I knew all these labels. And I was like, hey, what if I take an approach of trying to do this book by talking to all the people who knew Doom, all the people around it, because obviously I'm not going to be able to talk to Doom, right? So I'm going to use his interviews where he's directly talking, but then I'll also contact all of these people who he worked with. I'll contact his friends, his family. So I ended up talking to about 50 people altogether. And let me say, I thought it would be a challenge, but people were very forthcoming, and most people really wanted to talk to me about Doom, because he is such an interesting character and there's so much to say about him. The only people who didn't want to talk to me were his inner circle, the people who were really close to Doom. Those are the people who knew him the best, like Prius, like Keo, who made the mask, like Bobito, Jasmine, his wife, she's also very private, like Doom, very low key. I reached out to these people, MF Grimm, another one. I reached out to these people and they didn't want to talk to me, as much as I tried to convince them. And, I'm good with that, because what that signifies is that these people were really good friends to Doom, and they were really loyal friends, and because Doom was such a private person and didn't put himself out there like that, They were just basically kind of protecting his privacy, and I totally respect that.
Yeah, it's sort of an anomaly in the age that we live in now, where so many artists and public figures are sort of constantly cloying for attention and going live and selfies and backstage access. Not only were you dealing with creating a book on a subject who was deceased, and so there wasn't going to be any chance of an interview, but his whole sort of legacy and brand, we might say, was built on being enigmatic. There's that to me is probably one of the bigger challenges, whether he, was still with us or not, that so much of him, there's very little, and you talk about in the book, there's very few songs even in the catalog of his where he, raps from a first person perspective. Like, this guy was about that life of not necessarily letting people in, and it's not just the symbolism of a mask. That was pretty much inclusive of the way he operated and the way he rolled.
And I totally respect that as well, because I'm a low key figure. I'm very private. I'm not really on social media like that, So in kind of researching Doom, I just saw that we had a lot in common in a way, And another thing that a lot of people don't know about Doom is that he was really into all of this body of esoteric knowledge, what I like to call the occult.
Right.
Which is basically, it's not black magic. Occult just means hidden knowledge,
Sure.
So that could be conspiracy theories, UFOs, ancient alien theory, crystals, all of these things that get lumped into that hidden knowledge department. Doom was a huge, he was kind of like a scientist in that way. He studied this, and you don't really see it overtly. You see it in some of his rhymes and some of the references he has, but I think this is more like how he lived as a person. He was just hungry for knowledge,
soaking it up,
information, just absorbing all of this information from so many different places, and like when I talked about the Vic Vaughn album in the book, you kind of get a sense of that, how they were talking about how they would like read they were all in the studio together creating, and then how they were passing around like a Scientific American and talking about like the gray goo scenario,
right?
Like nanobots taking over the world, and that made it into a rhyme. That's how Doom operated. He was just into this like totally random esoteric information, and somehow he would reference that in his work. So
right. I also remember in the book you were talking, I think it was around the Born Like This era, in speaking with his like the person in the UK who was letting him crash on the couch, that he was just going on deep YouTube excursions and like pulling information from that. So it's fascinating even to not have that. It's because he presented as such a persona, it's weird to even think like MF Doom like looked at YouTube videos like that.
Yeah,
seems like it's so
like because really his public persona to me is one of is humorous.
Right.
It's like humorous, subversive, kind of self-deprecating.
Yeah.
But this is like, if someone else ever does a book about Doom, I hope they talk about this even more. Like if one of his close friends do a book, because that's something that is still a mystery to us. I think as much as I revealed about Doom in the book, I think he still is a mystery. He still has a lot of mystique intact, so.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you obviously took a long time to research and look into things. There are, it's a very comprehensive book. Though I also liked, that you sort of divided the, Mad Villain has its own chapter, and Venomous Villain has like a sort of short afterword to the, Victor Vaughn album. I'm curious to know, as somebody who was obviously already well acquainted with both the culture and, the catalog and the story of Doom, what era of his life in researching and writing this book did you learn the most about, and like what sort of surprised you, or maybe was like kind of tickled your imagination when you learned about him in creating the book?
Well, I think the missing years really, and I think that's what people. I think that's what a lot of his fans and readers of the book are going to be interested in too. That the the time between him losing the deal with Elektra in '94 and him coming back as MF Doom in like late '97 was like when he first put out the first single. So there's that 3 years in there, maybe 3-4 years, where he basically kind of represented himself like he was homeless.
Right.
He wasn't really homeless. He did have places to crash and everything, and he was making money. The whole drug dealing thing was going on at that time. That was a surprise to me because Doom is not of that milieu.
Right.
He's not like this street rapper, who talks about drug dealing in his rhymes and stuff like that. He's a middle class guy from suburban Long Island, grew up in a stable house with two parents for the most part.
Yeah.
So he's not trying to represent that lifestyle. So
we've grown so accustomed to hearing rappers talk about drug dealing that it almost feels unfathomable that a rapper could be dealing drugs and not rapping about it. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's what I love about Doom. He's probably the only rapper who didn't brag about dealing drugs when he did.
Right.
When he actually did do it. So you gotta give him props for that, because a lot of people are kind of like they define themselves by that, or they define themselves by how much weed they smoke and stuff like that. But Doom was totally going against the grain. It's like he didn't wear a chain. He wasn't into the fashion aspect of rap. He was into the art aspect of rap. And to me, that's the most important thing. And that's why I hold him in such high esteem, because, I come from an era where it was every group that came out was different. Everyone was trying to be original. No one was trying to copy everyone else. And then, as you move along, as rap gets more popular and more commercial, it's just like it becomes a formula, and everyone's trying to stick to the same script. But Doom was that dude who just said, no, we're gonna do things differently, So that's another reason why I respect him so much, as an artist.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of, like peeling back a lot of the emotional and like personal, well, I don't want to say emotional, but in terms of peeling back a lot of the more personal, elements of his life, it did strike me in reading this too. And this isn't like disparaging. I just, it lent a more human element here. Where you're reading about it, it's like, oh, this guy does kind of seem like he was a functioning alcoholic. And that was, tough to read, but also informative to read. It doesn't necessarily, I know that the family has been very private about his health and basically the end of his life. I don't think that they ever, or did they like actually talk about what his cause of death was?
Yeah, actually, Jasmine actually revealed that.
That's right.
He was talking to the UK papers because there was actually a what do you call it, like a hearing.
Because he was sort of neglected in the hospital.
And also that's why I felt it was all right to reveal his cause of death, and because now it's public.
Yeah,
I was very careful about certain things. Like I didn't want to mention his kids in there at all.
Yeah,
I mentioned Malachi because Malachi passed away, and that was a huge, obviously had a huge impact on Doom. But I didn't want to talk about his kids or his personal stuff. Just really kind of focused on the music for the most part. But yeah, you're right. Doom, he does kind of reference his drinking on certain tracks. He kind of makes fun of it. And that was another thing that I took pause on. How am I going to present this? And I actually called Prince Paul, who was actually kind of like Doom's mentor in the music industry. And I was like, I found out all this stuff about Doom. It was like, should I put this in the book? Paul was like, I think you have to, because it's like, that was who he was. And it's also kind of like a cautionary tale. It's like, uh, we revere artists, or we revere these people for what they do, but we don't realize that they're people too, and they
Mm.
have their personal struggles, and that's really what makes them human, like everyone else. Even though we might put people on a pedestal, that really kind of humanizes them when they do have these struggles. And Doom was just like anyone else. He had his struggles, he had his demons, and I had to, in doing a book like this, I didn't want to do a hagiography, where I'm just like Saint Doom.
Mm.
He was a flawed individual, like all of us are. He's a human being. None of us are perfect, and I wanted to reflect that too. Without getting disparaging, and without getting malicious or exploitative about it. You kind of have to mention, you have to talk about stuff like that. So
Absolutely. And I think you did a great job with that. And I mean, I think that, again, we're talking about desensitization. We have almost become accustomed now in media to all biographies or tellings of stories to be 100% sanctioned and controlled and filtered through the subject. And I don't know, I mean, I do know that I don't think that is always resulting in the best documentation of these stories, the best telling of these stories. There's a huge story that's going around now with the gentleman, the filmmaker who has made this 9-hour Prince documentary that was made for Netflix, and the estate is now trying to block it. But people who have seen it are saying that it's an incredible encapsulation of who he was, and the good parts and the bad parts. And I think that as artists become more savvy and more, basically taking ownership of how their stories are told, I suppose I can understand how it's empowering for them in controlling the narrative, but you don't always get the best and most, accurate results when the subject is controlling the narrative of the story.
I totally agree with you. That's why this book had to be an unauthorized biography without the participation or consent of the estate. And I should say that my first author copies, I sent one to his manager Sadiq from Rhymesayers,
Yep.
and one to his wife Jasmine with a personal note, just explaining to them why, my motivation for doing the book, and what I hope to accomplish with the book. And it's really, coming from where I'm coming from. I'm coming from the underground. I'm coming from the indie label scene. I consider myself a champion of the underground. Like,
Sure.
artists who don't get their due, I'm here to do that. So in a way that I feel like I'm, even though Doom is huge, he's got a huge fan base. I think more people need to know about him, and I think like the younger generation needs to know about him, because that's an example that we can really follow. This guy who went through all these trials and tribulations, reinvented himself, came back stronger than ever, and ultimately was able to do what he wanted to do in life and do it well. That's an inspirational story for anyone. Not even, you don't even have to like hip hop to
Right.
to like a story like that. So I think Doom's story has it all.
Was there an album of his because I'm assuming that you were listening to a lot of his music in making this and sort of pouring through it, but was your perception of any of the albums changed, or did it evolve in doing this? Because he's for the hip hop heads, we've all got our favorites. It's always fun to debate about what are the top albums in an artist's catalog, the ones that are like, yeah, that's pretty good. And then, and we're talking about artists being human, there's going to be some that maybe are not as strong as others. But I'm curious if your relationship to any particular body of his work changed in making this book.
Oh, that's another good question. Yeah, like initially, back in the day when I first heard Operation Doomsday, like in '99, I liked it, but I was like, oh man, he's sampling all this R&B shit, man. Or like he's sampling the drums from Boogie Down Productions. You can't do that. I had the same kind of
rules.
Yeah, I had the same kind of reaction as a lot of hip hop heads. But that album grew with me over time, especially listening to it now, 20 years later. It just grew on me, and I was able to appreciate it more. Initially, I thought there were way too many skits on that album. I was like, oh man, this is another skit, And and I appreciate Doom's skits a lot more too, because there's a lot of information in those skits, like it's all very subliminal, but the way he painstakingly puts these together, and it's just like, you got to listen to them because there's value in there. So Operation Doomsday is one album that I initially didn't like as much, but I've come to like really appreciate. Also, a couple of the latter albums that I hadn't really messed with before, like Key to the Cuffs and Born Like This. Those are phenomenal albums because they show Doom's growth as an artist. And now, like, finding the backstory of those albums, I can really kind of relate because, Doom was like, at one point, he was like, I'm getting all the same kind of beats.
Right.
Everyone thinks there's like this Doom sound, like these really quirky, cartoony beats. But on those two albums that I just mentioned, it's like very experimental beats, very kind of progressive. And that shows an artist who's not afraid to expand his palette of sounds, and it's like, and like, he raps on the Batman song, he's like rapping really fast. And people thought that was like put together in post-production, but he was really rapping fast style for that. So that just shows his versatility as an MC too, because usually he's got that slow kind of conversational drawl, so he's just like a very versatile artist. And he was an artist who was constantly growing, and that's very rare in the game too, because usually once people kind of find their sound, they kind of rest on that and go on cruise control for the rest of their careers,
Right.
But this was a guy who was always trying to give us something different, always trying to be unpredictable. And you really have to respect that. I would say that the album probably that I least like out of his whole catalog is probably Neruvian Doom. Which is not, he doesn't rap on as much.
It's the production. And yeah.
And I think maybe he was a little too eager to work with this young guy who was just coming up.
Right.
Maybe if they'd given him a little more time to develop, it would have been better. But, it is what it is.
Well, gun to your head, top 3 MF Doom albums. What are the 3?
Oh, easily Mad Villainy. These are my top 3. Mad Villainy, Food, and Born Like This.
Interesting. My relationship with Born Like This, I was definitely checking for it when it came out, and I've been reevaluating it since reading the book and listening to a lot of these albums, some of which I was always listening to, and there are others that it's been a while. And I think my top 3 are Mad Villainy, Food. And then for the third slot, it's sort of like a tie between maybe Doomsday and also the Victor Vaughn album is one that I didn't like as much at first. But that's definitely, I think the Victor Vaughn album might have some of his best like rapping, like in a technical sense.
I think you're right about that. Yeah. That would be maybe number 4 for me.
Yeah.
I really like the beats on that. And the fact that he trusted these like newcomers to like do this, and also just how they worked on that album all together. They were all together in the studio when they were doing stuff. It was a special album in that way, and all of the producers were like really geeked to work with Doom. So it was just like a real special event, and it was totally not money. It's totally not money. It was just like, it was like pure art.
It also has one of my favorite RJD2 beats. I really love that Saliva beat on
Okay.
and then it's interesting. It's definitely not acclaimed, and even in your book, it gets like a paragraph. But oddly enough, I lived in Orlando for years, so I know a lot of the people who were involved in the Venomous Villain album. One of my best friends actually produced a few songs on it, but the workflow of that album is, I'm sure you might have, come upon in the researching. This was definitely not like they were all in the room with Doom. They were all working with him. It was a bit disjointed, and I think that the results are there. But yeah, it's interesting.
I would have liked to find out more about that album. That was a very tough album to research. I couldn't find. I wish I had talked to you before. I could have talked to some of the
Stop the process.
I know Diplo was produced a track, right?
Yeah, because Diplo lived in Orlando for a brief time. But yeah, Israel Vasquez, who ran the label Ozone, the magazine, and then was involved in sort of piecing that together. And I haven't talked to him in years, but yeah, I'm really tight with like two guys who have, I think, like 3 or 4 credits on that. Da Vinci and Swanberger. They did a bunch of songs on there. But
okay.
yeah,
are they still doing music now? Or?
They are. I mean, Swanberger, they were both also in a group called Soliloquists of Sound that was signed to Epitaph for a couple albums, a hip hop group. And Da Vinci has been on the podcast before. He actually does musical playback and touring with Ms. Lauryn Hill. And then, and Swanberger is an amazing artist, painter, and musician, and he now lives in Seattle, and still works on music. But yeah, it's this weird thing that it's in their credits, but it's not necessary. I think even for them, it's a bit of a nebulous, ambiguous chapter to report on. I don't think that the people
involved. It's so hard to find. It's so hard to find that album.
I think that the people involved in the making of that album feel disconnected from that album, so it's not a surprise.
But it is worth it, if anything, just for that Cool Keith track,
Yeah.
To hear Doom and Cool Keith on a track, that was pretty wild.
Yeah, it's nuts. So you're going to be going on a book tour. You're hitting up different spots across the country. Beyond that, what are your plans moving forward? Like, it's got to feel you've probably singularly been thinking about a figure for longer than anybody normally would, just in the making of this book. So, like, do you feel like you still have Doom residue on your brain, or have you like closed that?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I want to keep it. I want to keep it till No, like, yeah, you're right. When you do a book like this, you end up spending years of your life with the subject. So you better make sure that you have a passion for the subject, or else the book is not gonna proceed well. So yes, it was pretty amazing to do this book, because I got to spend so much one-on-one time with Doom, listening to, just marinating with his music, finding out about his life, talking to people, talking to a lot of interesting people, and it's like, it's almost sad in a way that the book is out, because now I have to think of something else to occupy my time.
It's just as a book has chapters, life has chapters.
Exactly.
And the Doom chapter may be close, or the writing the Doom book chapter. Not that Doom has to end in your life, but yeah.
But it's it's like it's an experience. It's like I can hold the final book in my hand, but the book is really in my head. It's like an experience I went through. So, and it was a great experience. So no regrets. And I'm kind of, itching to start writing again. 'Cause like this year has been pretty much editing. And that's an important part of the process too. Pretty rigorous editing I did for this book. Like, a lot of passes and a lot of people looking at it and giving comments and stuff like that. But that's all good. It's like, It's
Yeah,
like,
it helps results in a better end result, obviously.
yeah, because it's very lonely when you're writing the book. You're kind of like in this tunnel, and then you like let it out, and you let other people give it the feedback. And the ultimate thing is when the book comes out and you hear feedback from the general public, because like obviously not everyone's going to like it. People will like it, people will not like it. I just I just feel that I just did the best job I could possibly do, and I have no regrets, and there's nothing I could do that could make this book any better. Obviously, if I could have gotten some of those interviews that slipped through the cracks, Jasmine, Curious, Big
Yeah.
Ben Klingon, it would have made the book much stronger. But I think I did the best with what I had, and I think it is pretty definitive as far as Doom's life and career.
There's absolutely nothing that exists before this that has such a comprehensive, overview of the from start to finish. And yeah, I mean, again,
and
there are
also
going to
also like also I provide a lot of context because Doom didn't exist in a vacuum. He's
right.
being influenced by the stuff that's happening around him, the different eras of hip hop. So it's like context is very important when you do a book, because it's you know
Well, particularly for somebody who drew so much from other realms in creating his identity, from like Marvel,
exactly.
and that whole world of creating his persona, the music that he was sampling, the information, like he was sampling music, he was sampling ideas and philosophies that informed the music that he made, and so this book definitely goes through all of those rabbit holes, and yeah, I mean. This episode is obviously an endorsement for everybody listening. If you are an MF Doom fan, and you probably are if you're listening to this show, you definitely should check this out. It's available wherever you get books. The Chronicles of Doom. Yeah, SKIZ. I mean, anything else you want to plug or talk about that you have coming up, or are you still figuring out what the next step is?
Well, I've written two biographies. My last two books have been biographies of artists that I really respect. Wu-Tang being one, a group, and MF Doom, solo artist. And as I said, you got to be really passionate about your subject when you're writing a book. So um, I don't think there's any other rap artist out there that I'm this passionate about. So maybe I'll do something outside of hip hop on the next one.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you for your time. Appreciate you, and this was a great conversation.
Thanks a lot.